Okay, so this week or this month, this time, I wanted to talk about the Buddhist path as a whole. And the main reason for this is very often in Buddhism, people or teachers focus on a particular area to the exclusion of other areas of Dharma. And usually it's the thing that that person is good at doing themselves. So monks very much like to teach about monasticism because it's close to us and it's very relevant. Some people like to talk about healing because they've practiced or done various healing practices or have struggled with their own health issues, and so on and so forth. And one of the big focuses to the exclusion of other things in recent years has been mindfulness, or this word mindfulness, which without doubt is a very clear and important part of Buddhism, perhaps even central part of Buddhism. But when it's given to the exclusion of the other teachings, it's out of context. And so one's view of Dharma becomes a little fixated on certain issues that you can understand or that you can relate to the exclusion of other issues that you can't understand or you can't relate to. I tell one story. In my university here in Thailand, we hosted Thich Nhat Hanh several times when he came to Thailand, in part because we have a hall that's big enough to hold him and all his followers. We have the facilities, people can come down and camp, and there's plenty of toilets and bathrooms, they organize food, etc. And so he came and gave a Dharma talk in English, translated into Thai. And some of the Thai students there who I knew, I asked them, what do you think of Thich Nhat Hanh afterwards? And this one monk, he was like, he said, "Mai tarai," which means not much. And I said, why do you think not much? And this monk said to me, because all he says is, there is this problem, just be mindful. There is this problem, just be mindful. There is another problem, just be mindful. So a little unfair category way to describe Thich Nhat Hanh. But it's certainly true that in that Dharma talk, he has this very beautiful presence and beautiful way of speaking. And it says something that maybe 3,000-4,000 people had turned up into this forgotten corner of Ayutthaya province to come and spend several days with him. So there's no question about or his influence within Dharma. But it does highlight the point that so many teachers or people focus only on that one thing that they themselves like to practice or like to do, to the exclusion of the rest of Dharma. So very often I've heard many teachers say things that simply are not true according to the original scriptures, which we call suttas in Buddhism. So the suttas that we follow in Pali or Theravada Buddhism is called Pali language. Pali doesn't technically mean language, but it's close enough. And these are the teachings that are purported to be the closest to the original Buddha that we can find. After the Buddha died, the Sangha split up. There were some 16 or 18 different schools. Some of these schools are very close and very similar, and some of them were quite divergent. So Theravada was in fact one of these schools. So it isn't quite the perfect original teaching, but it is as close as we can historically get to the actual word of Sakyamuni Buddha. So within these teachings are, in fact, many elements, which is the things that different teachers focus on. But a number of times the Buddha would actually give a talk and describe the path in whole, the whole complete path from very beginning to the very end. Arguably, he does this in every sutta. He picks on something and then shows how you can use that one thing to take you towards enlightenment. But sometimes he would lay out the complete path from start to finish. And he would actually do this in different ways. So each time he did it, we would have to acknowledge that that may not be the one and the only and the perfect way. It may contain certain elements and not contain other elements. Nonetheless, this is the best that we have for describing the path of Buddhism, the path of enlightenment. I want to emphasize a couple of things before we get started on this particular sutta that I've picked out for us to look at today, which describes the path in 10 distinct stages or 10 distinct practices. And those are the 10 things that we'll go through today. I want to point out, though, first that the Buddha was first and foremost a mystic. He was talking about this mystic experience that arises when a person turns the attention inwards and, crucially, must abandon thinking, speculating, imagining, and the movements of the mind. The mind has to stop still within the teaching of Buddhism. The Buddha taught this many, many times. If you stop the mind still with awareness, what happens is the mind starts to coalesce and starts to unify. Ekatibhava, which means becoming one, unify, will center itself, will become radiant, will become aware. And so this was the mystic path that, in fact, mystics and hermits and sages have gone off into the deserts or into the mountains, into the caves, in order to find. In every culture across the world at all times that we know of, there have always been these people who have been drawn to this mystic experience. I call it mystic because it is a mystery. It's not something that can be explained or put into words. It's something that has to be experienced. And it can only be experienced when the ordinary mind is given up. So if you think of the Zen analogy that you cannot put clear water into a cup of tea, you have to tip the tea out of the cup before you can fill it with the clear water. Well, clear water throughout all cultures, in fact, is a symbol for the purified consciousness. The main reason consciousness itself has no form, has no shape. It relies on the object to which it is attached. So if you are conscious of your computer right now, that's your consciousness taking the shape of the computer. If you are conscious of the sounds in your eardrum, that's consciousness taking on the form of the sounds. If you are conscious of the feelings in your right foot, then consciousness has taken that form. So water lends itself to this analogy very well. And also the fact that water can arise in different states, can be choked with weeds, it can be muddy, it can be violent, it can be filled with unpleasant creatures, but it can also be purified and still bright and clear. So this analogy of this Zen analogy of emptying out the cup in order to give rise to a new form of consciousness, a new way of seeing or of being. This is what the saints and sages and mystics around the world have been doing and trying to get to. The Buddha himself had a word for this. He said samana brahmana. So samana was the tradition in India, long predating Buddhism, of people that would go into the forest and try to take on the form or the power of animals. So they would imitate animals, or they would wear animal skin, or they would go naked, or they would go on hands and knees, or they would eat only bark and leaves. And these are what we summarize today as ascetic practices, most of which, according to Buddhism, are not going to help you very much. However, we do still do ascetic practices, and the monk form is still at heart an ascetic practice. Ascetic means renunciation or to give up, for those who are not native English speakers. The other tradition in India at the time was the Brahmana tradition, which had come from the Aryan people. We might call the Vedic tradition. And this was a different kind of being. And they would learn scriptures and suttas and recitations. And they carried, in fact, with them the story of enlightenment. Whereas the Samana tradition, so far as we know, aspired only to gain the powers of animals or supernatural powers. The Brahmin tradition carried with it the teaching of enlightenment, or the amata. Mata means to die, amata means not dying or deathless. So the Brahmin traditions carried with them this teaching of the amata, the deathless. And if you read the Vinaya, one of the first utterances that the Buddha makes after he became enlightened was, I have found the amata, I have found the deathless. He called the Dharma the drum of the deathless. So this idea of a state or a condition or an essence, whatever you like to call it, that doesn't arise and doesn't cease is the essence of the mystic path. So the Buddha frequently said samana brahmana, which means all the mystic seekers, all the religious seekers in the world think like this or do like this, should act like this, and he would call them to him. So the mystic path is very definitely one of a mystic attainment. We have to go beyond the ordinary mind, step outside the normal machine or the mechanism of the thinking, feeling, experiencing, into a new thinking, into a new experiencing. And I very much emphasize this in my own practice, that even things like the sila, the morality, these are there to support the steadying of the mind that can move into this new way of being, new way of experiencing. Now, whether we will attain to enlightenment or not, certainly for all intelligent, regular people, we can get onto this path and start to see, feel, and know directly some of these enlightenment experiences, and feel the way that they are directing us, feel what they are directing us towards. So in this particular sutta, the Buddha raises an analogy that there is a disciple of the Buddha wandering through the forest, and someone asks him, how do you know that your teacher is the real teacher? And he said, well, it's like this. I can't say thy teacher is the one real teacher, but when we look at the footprints in the forest, the greatest of all footprints comes from the bull elephant. All other footprints that we can find fit within the bull elephant footprint. He said, in the same way, we can go and examine the teacher and examine his teaching, and we find out that the entirety of the spiritual path is contained within his teaching and has been explained by him. And for each part of that teaching, as we practice it, we can come to know directly and experience directly for ourselves some of these initial states or the truth of Dharma, and thereby gain confidence in the teacher all the way to enlightenment. So if we're ready, I want to get started with, I'm going to switch over to the screen share. What I've done, I should give you first of all the actual sutta is called the shorter simile of the elephant's footprint. And you'll find this is Sutta 27 in the Majjhima Nikaya. So I put that into the chat. For those of you who would like to read the entire sutta afterwards, which is well worth reading, it has some nice descriptions in it. That should be enough to let you Google it and find the sutta. One other point I should mention, in Theravada Buddhism, all the teachings are given. The Buddha himself said this many times, that he is given the entirety of the teaching and the entirety of what you need to get enlightened without keeping anything back. And so this is at odds with some later teachings which claim to be esoteric teachings from the Buddha, that he gave some teachings to the ordinary people who weren't very bright, but for the really smart people, he gave this secret teaching. And this teaching has been discovered in a pot underneath a monastery in Tibet 800 years ago or something like that. And there we have the secret teaching. Well, according to Theravada, the Buddha said many, many times that his teaching is open, is given to all, is free to all, and has been explained to all without keeping anything back. In the words of the sutta, with an open hand. So that's why I put the link. We monks and Theravada monks, we don't have any secret teachings that you lay people are not privy to. You can also go and see the exact same things that we have, the exact same text that we use, without any restriction. So if I can go to the first part of the sutta. After this chance meeting, by the way, the man says that there is the elephant's footprint, and he sees the Buddha later, and the Buddha says that's fine, but you need to explain the things that fit within that footprint. So the Buddha actually gives 10 elements to the path, or 10 parts describing the path from start to finish. And I think I can do it this way. I still haven't quite mastered. So the first part of the sutta that the Buddha said, first of all, the prerequisites for becoming enlightened is there has to be a Buddha's teaching in the world living. So we are now in the age of Sakyamuni Buddha, which means that that's the living teaching. That means that his teaching is still present, still alive, still being practiced, and still being taught. And this is really important, I found, because when I was young, nobody told me about this teaching of enlightenment. I remember very clearly as a child, I was driving along with my father in the van, and I saw a man meditating on the lawn in his front yard. And I said to my father, "What's he doing?" And my father said, "He's meditating." And I said, "What's that?" And my father said, "He's wasting his time." Again, I had meditation experiences when my body would become very large. And I said to my mother, "What is it?" And I tried to explain the experience. She said, "I don't know what you're doing, but it isn't very good." Now, I can't blame my parents. They didn't know about Buddhism. They had no way to tell me or explain to me. But it makes a point that if it hasn't been brought to your attention, if you don't know about it, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to find the practice. Even the Buddha himself, he practiced meditation as a child. And then later, when he was an adult and he'd given up on the ascetic practices, on the night of enlightenment, and he sat underneath the Bodhi tree. Do you remember what he experienced? He said he remembered the jhana or concentration experience that he'd had when he was a child. So even for the Buddha, he'd started to attain in the right way, but unless somebody is around to tell you what these experiences are, to point you towards them, then you're simply not going to know about it. So we need a teaching of a fully awakened Buddha. And in our age, our eon is a particularly auspicious eon because we will have 5 Buddhas, apparently. And Sakyamuni was the 4th of these 5 Buddhas. And he was a Buddha whose teaching is based on wisdom, which is the not the best kind. The lowest form of Buddha is teaching based on faith. The higher form of Buddha is one based on wisdom. And the highest form of Buddha will be one based on heroic struggle. I don't know what his heroic struggle means, but for me, myself, my heroic struggle is a little weak. So I'm hoping to use the wisdom teachings. The next Buddha, Maitreya Buddha, is supposed to be one of heroic struggle. I wouldn't put too much stock in these particular things. These are the legends that have grown up. They're there. We don't have to worry about them too much. So Buddha's teaching arises in the world. He's one who is accomplished. He knows the world. He's there for those who wish to train. Teachers of gods. Gods here means devas. So the devas, the beings in the higher realms, but not a creator God. That's a different thing altogether. So the thing that I put up on the screen here is actually a stock phrase that you find in many, many, many suttas. And they would use these stock phrases as a way to aid memorization, so that whenever you're hearing a new teaching, it will tie into these stock phrases, and the monks would recite these phrases to each other, and it helps them to be able to remember the recitation. So what you see here is a stock phrase. I've jumped a little bit. I jump backwards. So the second part, after hearing about the teachings, they gain faith in the Buddha and they reflect to themselves. Living in a house is cramped and dirty, but the life of one gone forth, and the word gone forth means to ordain as a monk, or as a samana, in fact, not as a monk, is wide open. It's not easy for someone living at home to lead the spiritual life full and pure like a polished shell. Why don't I shave off my hair and beard, dress in the saffron robes, and go forth from lay life to homelessness? So they give up their large or small fortune and their large or small family circle. They shave off their hair and they go forth into homelessness. So the Buddha clearly says that to get onto the path here, really you need to go and ordain as a monk or as a nun. What does that mean for us for lay people? Can lay people practice too? This is a question I have for you. The next phase was the highest sila, and here the Buddha describes the precepts, basically the 8 precepts, and notes that he's giving this teaching to monks. So at that time, the monks' vinaya didn't exist, and the monks felt it was sufficient to practice the 8 precepts rather than taking on the 227 rules of the Patimokkha and the 5,000 or so rules that are in the Vinaya text itself. At that time, the Buddha would ordain people. They would request to become part of his Sangha, and he'd say, "Come forth, monk," and he'd give them a robe, and that's it, they're ordained. And they would keep the 8 precepts. So in the sutta, it actually breaks the 8 precepts up slightly differently and gives some very nice descriptions. It's well worth reading this particular description. So it gives up from killing beings, stealing, sexual misconduct. False speech is divided into the 4 kinds of wrong speech. False speech, i.e. lying. Malicious speech, which he describes in the sutta as speech which divides people and pushes people apart. It doesn't unify, which is very interesting because a lot of monasteries in Thailand, they like to tell you how the other monastery isn't as good, but their monastery is the right teaching. And we can fall into this one sometimes, divisive speech. He abstains from injuring seeds. He eats only once a day. He doesn't go out at nighttime or at inappropriate times to see dancing, singing, shows, music. He doesn't wear garlands or scents, use high or low beds. We count this as meaning luxurious quarters. Refrains from accepting gold and silver. Refrains from accepting raw grain. We are not supposed to accept things that you have to cook. From raw meats, he abstains from women and girls, from slaves, from goats, sheep, fowl, pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, and mares. He abstains from accepting fields and land, which is interesting because a lot of monks, they really like to get land and build their monasteries on them. If it's in the terms of a sangha, the sangha itself can take land and build. But if it's in terms of an individual, they're not supposed to do that. If you're interested, I can tell you in Thailand, sometimes the abbots actually own the land personally, which the temple is built on. And this has become a controversial thing within Thai law. If you want to know about that, ask me later. So abstains from false weights, metals, measures, interesting. Abstains from bribes, deceiving, defrauding, trickery, wounding, murdering, binding, brigandage, plunder, and violence. Oh, I like this one. He abstains from running errands and taking messages. One of the examples of this, if you're interested, was running errands or taking messages. One of the examples was acting as a, I don't know what the word is, a fixer-upper, like an auntie that's always trying to fix up the niece or the nephew with a date and try and get people, a matchmaker, is that the word? Okay, so one of these things, running errands, was described in another sutta as don't be a matchmaker, which I guess in India at the time, that was a big thing, right? Finding a match for your daughter, your son, must have been a very big thing. So the monks were not allowed to do this. We're going to flip on just because we have so much time. After going forth, the now monk or nun becomes one who is content with the 4 requisites. So it says becomes content with robes to protect his body, arms food to maintain his stomach. And wherever he goes, he sets out taking only these with him. They're also content with simple lodging and content with basic medicine, one of which is fermented urine. So for me, myself, I am not content for my medicine to be fermented urine. I'm going to go and get proper medicine. Just as a bird, wherever it goes, it flies only with its wings, so too the bhikkhu becomes content with just these requisites to protect them and maintain the life. Again, there's a number of things we can say about this, but we're going to press on. If you have questions, note them down. We can come back to any of these points. By the way, after each of these clauses, the Buddha would give some of the indicators that this is the spiritual path. So on this one, he said, possessing this aggregate of noble virtue, he experiences within himself a bliss that is blameless. So for each of these clauses, I haven't included them just for space, but he will give one of these lines saying, if you do this, you will have this benefit, will be peace or bliss or blamelessness, etc. The next one is guarding of the senses, which is my personal primary practice. And those of you who know me will know that I focus on this to the exclusion of most other practices. Guarding of the senses had a very clear, straightforward formula. When you see something with the eye, you do not grasp at the signs and features of that thing. If you leave the eye unguarded, unwholesome states and grief can invade your mind. So you practice the way of restraint. You guard the eye faculty, undertake the restraint of the eye faculty. Then he says, on hearing a sound with the ear, on feeling a feeling with the body, on tasting a taste with the tongue, on smelling a smell with the nose, and on thinking an idea with the mind. All of these are senses, and all of these need to be guarded against. Because if you pay attention to the signs and features, what does that mean? I can give you an example, actually. Just now I went chanting, and some people made their offerings, and one of the things they offered was this one here. I don't know, you can see that. It depends which screen you have enabled. This is dark chocolate with a touch of sea salt, lint. Now, if there's one thing that I'm not keen on, it's dark chocolate. I just don't like dark chocolate at all. In fact, I'm not. Some things I don't like much, but I'll eat them just because it's got sugar or something, but dark chocolate. So what am I doing? I'm paying attention to the signs and features of that thing that I can see, this chocolate bar. It's not milk chocolate, it doesn't have sugar, blah, blah, blah. Once you pay attention to something, your mind gets locked into that thing and you start creating stories around it. You like it and you dislike it. You have memories about it. What will you do with it? Blah, blah, blah. For meditators, this is what we don't do. Whatever occurs to our senses, to our mind, to our memory, to our body, to our ears, to our eyes, we don't allow the mind to get drawn in and start to judge it, differentiate it. You hold the mind restrained. This, for me, is almost my entire practice. Guarding of the senses. The next one is mindfulness. One who acts in full mindfulness, full awareness. There are different ways to translate the term mindfulness. I just want to give my translation. The actual word in the sutta is sati sampajanya. Sati means to remember. Sampajanya means awareness. So you're remembering your own awareness. This awareness arises when you guard the senses. So it doesn't mean that you get absorbed in what you are doing. It means the opposite. You don't get caught in what you're doing. You remember yourself, remember your awareness, remember your presence or your life force, if you like. So this memory you maintain when looking ahead, looking away, flexing or extending the arms, wearing robes, carrying the robe, carrying the bowl, eating, drinking, tasting, defecating, urinating, walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking, talking, and keeping silent in all of it. So pretty much anything that you're going to do, you are supposed to maintain this clear awareness or self. I like the word self-possession. So your mind is not getting caught up in what you are doing. Having this guarded senses and mindfulness, one practices the abandoning of the hindrances. So possessing this noble restraint of the faculties, he resorts to a secluded place, forest, a root of a tree, a mountain, a ravine, a hillside, a charnel ground, a jungle thicket, an open space, or a heap of straw. But very definitely, this is a withdrawal from the world. And this also is a point that sometimes is not very well emphasized. Some traditions really focus on continual engagement with the world, or even teach that you should have a job and that you should have family, and that's the right way or the best way to get enlightened. The Buddha said you have to withdraw yourself. You have to take yourself out of this normal society's way of being. Now, if that's not taking yourself out as a monk or a nun, it's taking yourself out for retreats, or it's taking yourself out for a couple of hours a day or in the evening, or whatever you can manage. I want to, out of these 5 hindrances, which I'm sure you've seen before, I want to point out the third one, abandoning of sloth and torpor, or I like to call it indolence, because it's a part of the mind that doesn't want to be awake. If you abandon that indolence, the mind becomes percipient of light, mindful and fully aware. This is very important and doesn't get emphasized enough. Time and time again, over and over, the Buddha said, in the meditation, you should become aware of light. So bringing light into your meditation is the right way to do it. And it often doesn't get mentioned. If your mind starts to attain in the right way, it becomes bright, a description that you can only call bright. So, having resorted to a suitable place, the 5 hindrances are abandoned. Having abandoned them, one enters into jhana, into concentration meditation. This also is a slightly controversial point because many or most Vipassana teachers these days tell you that concentration is wrong. What you should do is mindfulness. Well, in the original suttas, there was no either mindfulness or concentration. It was concentration was continually recommended by the Buddha. He said many times, if you attain to high concentration, that's not enlightenment. But he didn't say you shouldn't concentrate. He continually said you should use this concentration of mind. So he enters upon concentration. I just put in one of the descriptive verses from the sutta, which, as I say, he would do after every clause. This is called a footprint of the Tathagata, something scraped by the Tathagata. Scraped means the sign of an elephant is that its tusks have scraped the trees or the rocks. So that's why he says scraped here. Something marked by the Tathagata, just in the same way as you're on the trail of a bull elephant to check whether the elephant really was the footprint really was the elephant's footprint. The latter line here, the stilling of applied and sustained thought, he attains upon second jhana, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind. Now, there are many different translations of this, but the best translations are the mind becomes unified and centered. Unified is ekate bhava. Eka means one or single or whole, and bhava means to become or to engage in. So he says the mind, the ceto, becomes one unified whole. And again, this is something that you can experience in meditation. It's the direct opposite to being scattered. If the mind is thinking about this and that and thinking about TV shows and family and money and house improvements, that's a mind that is scattered. This is the opposite. Ekabhava, the mind is centered and become whole or become unified. And this is very much part of the experience that one will have. Carrying on the jhanas, there's 2 more. 4 jhanas in total. Each one is a layer of concentration that's more refined than the one before it. So in the 4th jhana, if you see down the slide here, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides the 4th jhana which has neither pain nor pleasure, and purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. This is, again, something the Buddha said over and over again. If you have attained to high concentration, you have perfected mindfulness. So mindfulness and concentration was not one or the other. Mindfulness is perfected in meditation. So I put that little bit in italics just to make the point. You're in deep concentration, perfect mindfulness has been attained to. The actual word for mindfulness there is sati bala, which means the power of recollection. So 9, there are 10 stages in total. We're almost at the end. Having attained to high concentration of mind, when the mind is purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, he directs it to the knowledge of past lives. Now, this in sutta after sutta, the Buddha describes this recollection of past lives like this. Here I was born in this clan. I had this trade. I wore those clothes. I ate this kind of food. I had these people for my family. Then I died from that life and I was born in that clan with those foods, with those clothes, with that trade, etc. He's describing actual past lives, not something metaphorical. So some people, especially Westerners, they want to rewrite Buddhism and say, well, past lives, what that means is your childhood experiences that lie in your unconscious and that affect your behavior. Well, if that was true, then Buddhism would be about sending the mind into the unconscious and ferreting out your past experiences, which is pure Freudian psychology, which even psychologists these days tend to reject Freudian psychology. No, the Buddha was talking about actual past lives. So it's a super mundane or a supernatural insight. The second super mundane insight was the knowledge of the rising and passing away of beings in heavens and hells according to their karma. So I've seen this done with people. One of the masters that I sat with, and he had somebody looking through heavens and hells. So we say, I'll talk more if you want to ask questions, but he said, can you see those beings? And the man said, yes, I see those beings. He said, now plant in your mind the question, what is their karma that got them reborn in that state? And then he said, can you now see the karma that got them born in that state? And the man said, yes. So this is very specifically a practice that is given to high-level meditators if you've made the attainment. Any ghosts or devas or hell realms or demons, you can see what it is that they did that got them reborn in that particular situation. And that is supposed to give you the insight to make sure you clean up your behavior. My former boss, before he died, he said to me, when you see what's right and wrong, according to the heavens and hells, he said, there's no need for you to make an effort to do the right thing because you will automatically do it. And the third insight that he's gained is the destruction of the taints or the asava. Asava is the outflowing of the mind. So the outflowing of the mind is through ignorance, through becoming, which we can talk about that if you want, through sense desire, and through views and opinions. These are the ways in which the mind flows out, or another word that was used was floods. So floods up and floods out and loses that self-awareness, that original awareness. So when you see the destruction of the asava, the outflowings, or here it's translated as taints, that is attaining to enlightenment as a temporary experience. So it's nibbana, but you're not an arahant yet, because you will come out of that state of concentration and back in your normal life. But you will now have experienced what enlightenment is, and this will draw you into the correct path. Finally, then, having known the path, been drawn into it, and done your practice, one sees and knows that the mind is liberated from sensual desire, being, and ignorance. These three that I've underlined, sensual desire, being, and ignorance, are in fact the asava, the outflowings. Sometimes there is added a fourth one, which is views and opinions. When your mind is utterly liberated, you get the knowledge, it is liberated. Birth is destroyed, holy life has been lived, and there's no more coming to state of any kind of being. So the Buddha says, when you've experienced all that, then you know fully that the Buddha's teaching is the elephant's footprint. It contains all other teachings within it. So I've unashamedly given you the entire sutta. There's lots of interesting points and lots of interesting questions in that sutta. You may note this is not how most Dharma teachers teach. They will pick up one or two of these things. My own teacher, before he passed away, was one who had these supernormal insights, so he could see heavens and hells and ghosts and devas. So that was all he taught. That was what he taught to people. Of course, if you don't have the attainment to see those, which I didn't, then you're very confused because you don't know what he's talking about. And he said, never mind, you just carry on practicing. But that was what he taught. That was his thing. Other people like mindfulness, and some people like precepts, etc., etc. So I'm going to hand over if you have any questions.
I think, Pandit, just now you were talking about bringing light into your meditation. How do you do that?
One is to maintain the idea of light. Just keep it in the back of your mind. But what happens, it starts to become, the light is I call it self-awareness, or it's a feeling of brightness. So it's not really like a vision that you would have. It's a feeling of, that can only be described as light. Some people describe it as a light brighter than 10,000 suns. I think I've got the wrong bulb in my head because it's not quite that bright. But very definitely keep it in mind. And then one day when you're meditating, you'll say, hang on a minute, this thing that I'm experiencing now, I can call that light. And you say, okay, that's light. And it has a feeling of rightness about it. Most importantly, it has a feeling of dispelling any kind of indolence or reluctance. Because there's always part of your mind when you meditate that actually would rather just be putting your feet up somewhere, watching the latest episode of Breaking Bad, or I don't know what people are watching these days on TV. I watch Shark Tank. New season of Shark Tank just began. Because it's easier. So there's always part of your mind in meditation that is not committed. And the feeling of like, oh, well, how do I get 100% committed, which is what's required? That would be impossible. But as light starts to arise and you latch onto that, it becomes clearer and clearer. And like, okay, it feels good. It feels right. It feels happy. And so you follow that. There are various kinds. One is you'll feel light in the body. So you have a generalized body awareness. The body may feel very large or may feel very small. You may feel a very small body in the center of this body. Sometimes you can see lights. If you see lights, you have to be careful that if it's outside of yourself, don't get distracted. The only light that is the correct one is inside the frame of this body. It may also appear as a sphere of light, or it may appear as a sphere of light the size of a moon. Different people can have different experiences. Anyway, I wouldn't worry too much about it, but keep it in mind so that when you are meditating, I guarantee, in fact, all of you will have seen these things, but you overlook them because you're so keen on what the mind thinks about stuff. And that these experiences come up and they're actually quite subtle until you focus on them. And then what happens, your mind, is that a light? Is that the right light? Am I getting enlightened? What was that? What was it? And you're gone, you've lost it.
Yeah.
So, we have to be careful not to get caught up in visions of things. I'll tell you a quick funny story. There's a crazy man. I think I may have told you this. He came to the temple and he said that, and he could see our former abbot who died 50 years ago. He could see him in this enormous vision. And he came and gave this Frenchman a teaching. I'm like, okay. And then he came up to, this was in my temple here, then he came up to the temple I was living and he saw that former abbot there come and give a teaching. And it was a teaching of a wheel. He said, the teaching was the wheel is turning and you have to make it stop. I was like, okay, well, you're having these great visions. Me, I just see sleepiness and reluctance and horrible things in my mind, but you're having these fantastic visions, fine. Anyway, he said that this vision of the teacher saying the wheels must stop meant that the Frenchman should never get in a motor vehicle again because it makes wheels turn. So, and at the time he's applying for his visa and he had to go to Bangkok. He said, I'm not going to Bangkok because I have to make wheels turn. Like, that's not the meaning of the vision. Anyway, he would have these visions. I don't know what he was experiencing. I mean, anyway, so we had to throw him out because he caused trouble. And he went to Wat Pah Nanachat. They threw him out. He came down to Wat Phak Nam after I'd moved temples. And I had to throw him out of this temple as well because he was causing trouble. He went back to Wat Pah Nanachat, and I know the guest monk, and he told me, he said, no, we had to throw him out the second time. And then a couple of years later, he knocks on my door and he says, I'm here. I said, I can see you here. What are you doing here? He said, I've come. You wanted me to come to the temple. I said, I definitely don't want you to come to the temple. He said, no, you appeared to me in a vision and you told me to come to the temple. I said, right, you're mad. Out. Don't let me see you ever again. So that's the problem of getting caught up in visions. So very clearly, all spiritual teachings tell you don't get caught up in visions. There was one teaching from St. John of the Cross, actually, is a Carmelite mystic in the Carmelite Catholic tradition. And he said, if a vision comes from God, it will have the right effect that God wants, irrespective of what you think about it. If a vision comes from the devil, it's there to lead you astray. In both cases, leave the vision alone and have nothing to do with it. So I always thought that was a very good piece of advice. Don't get caught up in visions. However, light in the body, clear and present, is part of the correct way.
So I guess the practice is to be able to recognize it when it arises.
Yeah. With my own practice, what I do is guard the senses. And when I'm not allowing the mind to go out to any kind of perceiving things, what happens is the body starts to become bright, clear, mindful. And you can feel like when something starts to invade your mind and distract your attention, and it becomes dull and dark and closed. And when the attention comes back, it becomes light and clear again. And after a while, I realized, well, I just need to focus on that light and clarity. I don't need to guard the senses quite so tightly. Ramana Maharshi, one of the Indian mystics, he put it this way. He said, the worm on the trees, inches along the leaves. I don't know if you've seen them, but the worms swirl around in the air like this, trying to find something else to catch onto. And if they don't find anything, they inch along a bit further, and then they stand up on their, I guess, their only leg, their body, and swirl around again. He said in the same way that your mind will not let go of this world until it has something better to hold on to. So as the mind starts to attain in the right way, it is important to recognize it so that you let go of the old mind and start to move into the new mind, the new experience.
So does anyone would like to ask any questions or share your experience of your meditation practice?
Good question.
Yes, Joseph.
Yeah, because, I've read that it's kind of controversial in Buddhist thought, especially in Zen, whether we can use the term mysticism in the same way that other religions do, because in theistic religions, they're talking about union with God. But in Buddhism, there is no God. And so the question is there anything that you could call divine or sacred in Buddhism where we're trying to unite with that?
I've read a number of the Christian mystic texts, and I have no difficulty whatsoever in saying union with God. I think that's an excellent and a beautiful and a right description of it. So I don't have any problem with that. Reading St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, The Cloud of Unknowing, these kind of books, I think that it's exactly the same thing. Buddha Dasa actually wrote a book. I'm not a massive Buddha Dasa fan, but he wrote a book saying that Dharma is the same as God. And he, in the Christian sense, and he wrote a book explaining why, which was, I found actually quite good. But so there are these discussions around it. I should say that if one doesn't like Christian or the Vedic or Advaita terms, then don't use them. Buddhism has everything that you need. We don't have to go to these other traditions. I personally have found it very useful and beneficial in the books that I've read to study these other traditions too. So Nisargadatta Maharaja, I Am That, the book. Has anyone read that? I Am That? Raise your hand a little bit. Nobody? Okay, Meredith, you've read a bit of it. I've never met anybody that read the whole thing because it's all the same, right? All the way through, it's just the same. But I tap it into the chat. I have a very slow Bluetooth keyboard. It takes a minute to. I Am That by Nisargadatta. But he has a different way of talking about things, which is Advaita. There they talk about God a lot. Personally, I have no problems with it, but if it doesn't help, then don't use it, would be my advice.
Can we think, instead of maybe thinking that we're one with all beings, because that's an emphasis in Buddhism, that we're all one, or one with our Buddha nature? That's more of a Mahayana term, that each one of us has Buddha nature inside of us. And when we realize that, then we've become the Buddha.
Yeah, I don't know where this idea came from, that we are one with all beings, or that we are all interconnected. There's nothing like this in Theravada Buddhism or any other kind of Buddhism that I've seen of original, enlightened teachings. But I've seen a lot of 20th century teachers talk about, we're all one, and we're all. I've never seen it in a mystic text. I think it comes from Carl Jung. He had this shared consciousness idea, which has merit, but it's nothing to do with enlightenment. So we are all one. I would reject that thing altogether. We all have a common basis of humanity. We all have feelings of liking and disliking and fears. I mean, there are senses in which we are all kind of united, I guess. And another term, interconnectivity. I've never seen anything in Buddhism that suggests anything about everything is interconnected. He never talked about, the Buddha was always talking about this experience when you go inside. He wasn't trying to describe the world and like trees are interconnected with oceans, interconnected with the clouds, interconnected with my mood swings and blah, blah. No, I've never seen it. So personally, if somebody can make a case for it, I would be happy to read or listen, but I've never seen that. Now, what you said about Buddha nature, that was absolutely spot on. That Buddha nature is there; it's universal. It seems like Buddha nature is inside us from our deluded perspective. Actually, you are inside the Buddha nature, and you are an errant thought. You are a misthought, a misconception within the Buddha nature. So the Buddha nature is the container. You are the thing that's been invented and put into that container. But yeah, absolutely. In that sense, the point of the Buddha nature, certainly within the Theravada idea of the concept, was some people, especially samanas, felt that you had to replicate animals or sometimes eat certain parts of animals in order to get that power. So if you eat the heart of a tiger, you become strong, or stupid things like this. And people still have it. In China, they think if you eat the horn of a rhinoceros, it will, I don't know, what do you say, like Viagra. This is was aphrodisiac, is that the word? And this idea that if you imbibe somehow, an external thing, you will get that power. We have it also with things like Lady Diana Spencer. They sold off some of her dresses, and people paid $1 million for a dress that was worn by Lady Diana Spencer, like this, some kind of essence attached to the dress or something. And it isn't. It's just a dress or a pair of boxing gloves or whatever. But there was this idea that if we somehow do something, we will gain a function, we will gain a power, or imbibe or embody a power or something. And that was the basis of ascetic practices before the Buddha. And the Buddha came along and he said, no, the path is not something that you are gaining. It's not like something that you can learn like a language. It's something that you have. It's there, it's innate. But you have to stop the mind getting caught up in this delusion. Then that innate nature of the mind will shine forth. That was how Buddha nature was in Theravada Buddhism. It was a contradiction to the idea that you have to practice something and gain a new power or a new skill, in my opinion.
There's the questions in the chat say how to change one's thinking that not fall in an ordinary one.
We have to be careful about changing the thinking. If you change your thinking, you change your character, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. But in a mystic path, what we're trying to do is step out of the thinking mind altogether. Thinking about this and that, well, there are good thoughts and there are bad thoughts, but we have to give up all those thoughts and move into something completely new. We can use the word transcend. So I'm a little dubious about this idea of changing thinking, because that's psychology. That's what psychologists do. On the other hand, if you don't change your thinking, then you're not going to change at all, are you? So I think this is why the Buddha said, have good friends and companions on the spiritual path. They will help you to change your thinking or change your way of being.
All right.
I'm not sure also, if you change your thinking, are you sure that the thing that you're going to become is any better than the thing that you were before? I remember that may have been Lily Tomlin or someone, if I got that name right, who said, I told God when I was young that when I grow up, I want to be somebody. Now I realize I should have been more specific. So if you change your thinking, are you sure that what you're going to become is any better than what you were before? I've tried a number of times to change my character and become something else. And monks do it a lot. You know, we want to try and be holy, we try and be impressive, or we have a responsibility of certain kinds of behavior. And then, so you often see, especially the young monks, sometimes old monks too, but they're really trying to be a certain character. And it's funny, I saw them one time. We were in a van and we went to some chanting, and all the way in the van, Thai monk, as Thai people, they like to chit chat. So they're all like across the van, and that's, oh God, make it stop. And they were excited because you don't always get a chance to socialize, and they're in a van together. And so there's this chaos going on in the van. And then as we got to the layperson's house and we opened the door, suddenly all these silent monks just walked out of the van. So, yeah, you have to try and be someone. You have to try and fix your behavior. That's a good thing to do. But, you know, we want to step outside of this entire thing. We don't just want to do psychology.
So thank you so much, Bhante, for your teaching and your support to AEB. We really hope that you come back next year to continue teaching.
Okay, everyone.
Okay, all right,
Right.
then.
Thank you so much,
Thank you, Bhante.
Bhante.
Thank you.
Thank you so
I'll
much.
see you next
See
year.
ya.
Good night, Amy.
Amy.